The process of guiding the Minbari to a state where they could begin to understand the truth of the universe and grasp the fundamentals of the great technologies the Vorlons could offer would take the following 5,000 years. The Vorlons, a patient race that measures its lifespan in millennia, deemed this a reasonable estimate. Their only constraint was the opportunities this lengthy timeline posed for their rival race, the Shadows. Since the Shadows did not have any intentions of moving until their chosen race was prepared for the impending war, the Vorlons felt they had the necessary time to proceed with their plans. However, the 5,000 years that followed did not unfold as the Vorlons had anticipated, primarily due to interference from the Shadows and the inherent nature of sentient beings to make their own choices, often disregarding logical outcomes. While the Minbari developed both intellectually and physically in accordance with the environment shaped by the Vorlons, a basic level of illogical emotional behavior persisted in their culture, despite the aliens' best efforts to eliminate it. This chaotic tendency frustrated the Vorlons, but they refrained from taking more stringent measures to control it, fearing that such actions might undermine the Minbari's effectiveness when called upon to fight against the great enemy. A certain level of emotion was deemed acceptable, even preferable, to ensure enthusiasm and morale in combat. However, the Minbari's inwardly aggressive tendencies were a source of concern. Simultaneously, the Vorlons wanted to prevent their chosen race from encountering other civilizations, which could lead to destruction or the incorporation of outside ideas that could disrupt their carefully controlled experiment. At the conclusion of Minbar's industrial age, the Vorlons largely withdrew, allowing the Minbari to develop under close observation, albeit with limited interference. To ensure that Minbar remained a closed system until it was time to use the Minbari as weapons against the Shadows, the Vorlons established a defensive perimeter around the planet and its nearby systems. No race venturing into this area was allowed to approach Minbar, and if any showed signs of noticing the hidden defenses or the planet itself, they were dealt with quietly and thoroughly. This barricade against outside contact lasted for 5,000 years and led to numerous incidents involving other spacefaring races in the Minbari area. Throughout these incidents, the Vorlons remained hidden but deadly sentinels, defending their experiment and preventing any prying eyes from getting too close. Whenever forces suspected to be working for the Shadows approached, the Vorlons subtly routed them out of the system without revealing their presence. A concerted effort by their ancient rivals could have jeopardized Minbar before the Vorlons could intervene, so subterfuge provided better protection than outright force. As a skirmish between Shadows ensued among the stars, the Minbari's rapid improvement, which had characterized the past few centuries, ground to a near halt without the constant aid of their mentors and divinities. The Minbari were intelligent and adaptable, but their long lifespans provided little motivation to strive for greater achievements when the advancements they had already made served them adequately. The Bright Barrier significantly reduced the number of intertribal wars to just a few skirmishes that occurred outside its confines. Within this barrier, its builders had subjugated nearby cities, and several clan lines formed and thrived among the civilizations that prospered during this relatively peaceful time. Far to the north, beyond the mountains forming the upper edge of the Bright Barrier, Minbari tribes ruled by telepaths who had developed their powers united under a single group of psychic leaders. They formed clans based on the bloodlines of these mentally gifted members of their race. This united city-state existed behind Vorlon technology, which was left behind to maintain the viability of their telepathic experiments. Thanks to the safety provided by these devices, the telepathic city-state grew disproportionately large compared to its martial skills. Hunting and gathering became the responsibility of the Minbari in this city-state, who lacked telepathy in their genetic heritage. Over time, they formed a clan dedicated to labor and service to others. This dedication gradually evolved from a sense of fear and subjugation to one of duty and responsibility. Thus, the bloodlines of the worker caste were established in later years. These families banded together for mutual protection, which foreshadowed the eventual formation of the Velshire. Meanwhile, the telepathic rulers of the northern cities became a powerful group, safeguarded by their energy barriers of alien design. They began to expand southward into the tribal lands of others. On the far side of the barrier, the tribal cities were unprepared for an assault from this previously unknown group of Minbari and quickly fell to them. Their numbers were no match for the superior tactics of the telepath-led forces. Within a few decades, two major power factions emerged on Minbar, separated only by the Bright Barrier and differing ideologies. During this period, the Vorlons observed the unexpected turn of their experiment. Most of their attention was directed elsewhere in the galaxy for reasons that may never be fully understood. However, the Vorlons assigned to protect Minbar were present when the telepaths began to harness their powers in warfare against their own kind. Rather than remove these telepaths from the dangers of combat, the Vorlons chose to watch impassively, curious to see if their abilities had become effective in battle. While their creations were certainly not prepared to confront the shadows, their skills were far from disappointing. The telepathic tribes, led by their psychic leaders from the safety of their Vorlon defenses, conquered a significant portion of the lands east of the Bright Barrier. Tribes that had something to offer were incorporated into their expanding empire, while others were either exterminated or pushed south into the less hospitable areas of the planet. On the western side of the barrier, the warrior nation grew anxious as they witnessed the emergence of a significant threat to their dominion. The Bright Barrier had served its purpose for millennia, but it was as much an imprisoning device for its builders as it was for their enemies. Though the barrier was constructed with heavily reinforced doors that could be operated from the controlling side, opening them meant breaching the defense against any opposing force preparing to invade. The telepath-led armies stationed strike teams at each of the garrisons along the Bright Barrier, ready to exploit any breach in the ancient wall. This standoff lasted for nearly 1,000 years as forces built up on both sides. The constant threat of invasion from the east or west kept tensions high, prompting both nations to develop better technologies and stronger defenses in anticipation of the inevitable conflict. That conflict arrived in the summer season of 3352 DV, coming without warning. While generations had lived and died under the threat of war, watching for the moment when either the telepath nation would discover a way to bypass the Bright Barrier or the warrior empire would build its forces to repel any invading army, neither side was prepared for the opening salvo to come from the planet itself. The ancient crystal bores drilled deep into the crust of Minbar to power the thermal defenses of the Bright Barrier had inadvertently created geological instability in the tectonic plates below. For centuries, this instability had existed without incident. Still, over time, the additional stress of the heavy wall widened small cracks until they coalesced into an irregular fault line just beneath the bedrock of the continental shelf between the two empires. In 3352 DV, the fault line finally split completely open, unleashing a massive earthquake that shook the area more violently than anything ever experienced on Minbar before. The aftermath of the earthquake and its subsequent aftershocks left the barrier in ruins, devastating both armies that had massed on either side. Even the Vorlons were taken by surprise by the intensity of the planet's upheaval and were unable to contain the damage effectively. The earthquake ultimately brought an abrupt end to the war between the two nations before it could even begin, prompting both sides to retreat to safety beyond the epicenters of destruction. Remarkably, the Second War of Minbari concluded within hours after generations of anticipation. The telepath nation viewed this as a sign from their gods, a notion that the Vorlons neither confirmed nor denied. For the united warrior cities on the western side of the sundered barrier, it was an inexplicable disaster that set them back centuries in development. The best and brightest among them had been stationed against the wall, equipped with the greatest war machines and weapons of their time. Although the loss was not insurmountable, it was devastating. The telepath forces retreated north, abandoning the cities they had conquered, while the warriors lacked the resources to pursue them. In the aftermath of the war, the powers of Minbar returned to the state they had been in before the northern armies began their invasion. The Vorlons studied this behavior and its underlying causes. The Minbari displayed a racial tendency to revert to old patterns and ways of thinking whenever faced with a crisis that was beyond their ability to understand. While this could be a helpful trait in certain circumstances, it could also lead to hesitation in the face of the great enemy, something the Vorlons could not allow in their chosen race. Overcoming this setback would be necessary, but the Vorlons were uncertain about the best way to proceed. To resolve their differences, Each Vorlon involved in the Minbari experiment was assigned a territory on the planet and given general guidelines they could all agree upon. The Minbari needed to be guided past this tragedy and reforged into the warrior race that the Vorlons would need to combat the shadows when the Great War returned. Furthermore, each territory would be managed according to the preferences of its respective controller. The Vorlons separated, continuing their work with the Minbari in complete autonomy, aside from occasional contact to compare progress and setbacks. Meanwhile, outside the system, the galaxy continued to evolve in its own ways. Other races grew and prospered, while some fell prey to the shadows and were either eradicated or used as pawns. Others found their own paths between the great forces battling for their futures. Some, like the race inhabiting the Epsilon system, developed powerful technology and maintained a neutral stance in the struggle. However, these independent worlds found themselves without allies amid battles that ravaged their territories, leaving entire solar systems silent between the skirmishes of greater galactic forces. On Minbar, thousands of years passed. This period was marked by numerous border wars, skirmishes over resources, and clashes over tactically essential locations. The unity of the warrior cities that had flourished before the fall of the Bright Barrier began to break down. The Minbari people diversified into separate clans based on hereditary bloodlines, as families moved away from each other to ensure their own survival in the diminishing safe areas of the main planetary continent. As a result, the Minbari returned to a nomadic lifestyle in large numbers, with only a few major cities and civilized areas remaining as permanent settlements. Near the end of 5,000 years of isolation, the telepathic nation began to recover from the devastating losses caused by their gods' perceived wrath. They once again dared to assert their dominance over the regions surrounding their northern territory. This gradual return to expansionism was prompted by the intermittent failures of the Vorlon devices that had been protecting their city-state, as well as another aspect of the original psychic experiment that had brought telepaths into the Minbari race. The original bloodline of these mentally augmented leaders was effectively ageless, and their ambitions could no longer be denied. The city-state had consolidated under the leadership of the original telepaths brought to Minbari. These ancient Minbari were preserved by the genetic sorceries of the Vorlons, who sought to ensure that their efforts would not be lost to the ravages of time before they could be thoroughly studied. Of the 30 original telepaths who returned from the stars, only 12 had survived the harsh centuries following their augmentation. These extraordinarily powerful telepaths, collectively known as the Kira-ji, reached out from their snow-capped mountain kingdoms, and those who were influenced by their will quickly followed suit. This new empire began to build carefully, gaining support on both sides of what remained of the Bright Barrier. Their cautious approach benefited the telepath lords. Their religious dictatorship became more attractive to smaller tribes because they initially presented themselves as an empire that could be joined willingly for mutual benefit. This strategy drew several clans into the empire's fold, though dissenters quickly learned that leaving was not an easy option. The remnants of the warrior cities were reluctant to join another empire, particularly one they blamed for the downfall of their own ambitions for conquest. This hostility prevented the telepath nation from offering any alliances. As their territorial boundaries extended to the northernmost edge of the land claimed by the warrior cities, the telepath lords prepared their forces for the possibility of battle. In the cities of the south, the warriors banded together once more, bracing for the impending struggle. This time, disaster did not avert the looming shadow of war. The telepath nation of Kiranil targeted the city of Goran as its first major conquest. For weeks, fierce fighting surrounded the town with no clear victor, until one of the Kiraji entered the conflict directly. The incredible mental abilities possessed by these first Minbari telepaths were overwhelming, dwarfing even the most formidable weapons of the warrior tribes. Accompanied by a group of progeny who had lesser but still significant telepathic and psychokinetic powers, these few shattered the defending army of Goran and devastated its defenses. The ease of this victory shocked both sides. For the warrior tribes, it was the first time they had witnessed such power, leading to a profound sense of inadequacy in their martial strength. Their advanced weapons and war machines proved effectively useless against the abilities of the Kiranael forces. In a desperate attempt to counter the overwhelming might of the Kiraji, The warriors bolstered their defenses and prepared for the worst. The Kira themselves were also surprised by this unexpected victory. Since the Dark Rift had claimed their armies millennia earlier, the Kira and their people had been certain of the gods' disapproval of their wars of conquest. As a result, they had not exercised the full extent of their abilities for so long that the memory of what they could do had been lost. Now, in the wake of such effortless success, the Kira saw a divine mandate in their actions. Such power could only signify the approval of their gods. This world and all its riches were theirs for the taking. With the call to arms sounded, each of the Kira prepared for battle. The Third War of Minbar had begun. In this conflict, no tribe remained uninvolved. The Kira initially struck across the globe to secure their dominance in the north. The time taken to achieve this allowed the warrior cities to prepare for the storm ahead. They did not remain idle during those years. Alliances were formed, new weapons were invented, and while the Vorlons silently watched their chosen race draw the lines of battle, the Minbari were engaged in the most violent conflict ever to touch their world. The army of Kira consisted of every northern tribe drawn into the struggle through diplomacy or sheer force, along with the 12 great generals of the Kira. Opposing them was the hastily formed alliance of warrior tribes and their servitors, holed up in their great cities and defended by barriers of stone and brave soldiers on the ground. While the warrior alliance lacked the unified strength of mind possessed by Kira, they did have superior numbers and more advanced weapons compared to the infantry of the Northern Empire. The war was fierce, with the Kira overwhelming any force they encountered, while the armies of the alliance successfully repelled advances that did not include one of their members. The leaders of Kira appeared unstoppable, but as they attempted to conquer a world, they could not be present on every front simultaneously. The battles in this war of domination quickly became a matter of the defending warrior alliance becoming agile enough to evade the Kira, while remaining coordinated enough to strike at their supply lines and garrisons. This tactic was only partially successful, leading to the abandonment of their cities and the exodus of their people to safer lands farther south. The existence of cities on the southern side of Minbar's equatorial wastelands today is a testament to how far the warrior and allied tribes had to flee to escape the might of the Kira assault. The Third Minbar War lasted for decades, forcing the entire northern hemisphere of the planet into a transitory nomadic existence. The warrior alliance had to stay one step ahead of the mighty Kira, while the forces of Kira remained mobile to avoid being caught by counterattacks. Neither side managed to secure a decisive victory. Although the alliance outnumbered the Kira, the latter were nearly invulnerable to retaliation. Over 50 years of constant conflict, only one Kira was killed in direct combat, an event resulting from an explosive ambush and an unprecedented level of concentrated firepower. However, this victory was short-lived, as the psychic death throes of the Kira shattered the minds of every living creature within a mile of the battlefield. Though it came at a bitter cost, the death of the first Kira offered hope to the struggling tribes of Minbar. The telepathic lords of Kira were not, as they claimed, immortal. They could be killed, though doing so required immense courage, significant power, and the potential sacrifice of thousands. As the Kira army intensified its efforts to eradicate their enemies, the allied tribes devised a desperate and dangerous strategy. It was potentially suicidal for all but the few who were left behind due to age or injury, but it was their only hope for survival. The Kira were no longer offering the option for surrender. It had become kill or be killed for every Minbari involved. Through a complex series of maneuvers over the next year, the allied tribes repositioned their forces between the main body of the Kira armies and their homeland, Kira. When they were in place, the tribes divided their numbers and launched a two-pronged attack at the moment of their apparent greatest vulnerability. Instead of moving out of the precarious situation between the hammer and anvil of the Kira and their nation, the allied tribes struck both forces simultaneously. This strategy was not without its risks. The attacks were conducted with only half the strength of the combined allied forces, leaving them without internal support. This was an all-or-nothing battle, and everyone on the field understood the stakes. With desperate determination, each half of the alliance surged into the heart of the enemy, catching Kira and its leaders completely off guard. This initial advantage generated a wave of momentum that carried them through the long night ahead on both fronts. The coordinated assault on the Kiraja forces resulted in a complete slaughter, with a fierce attack eliminating 2 of the invincible overlords within the first hour. The battle continued for days, eventually reducing the Allied army to only a few units as they faced an overwhelming force from the Kiraja, who massed for a final offensive. Aware of the Allied army's position and intentions, the Kiraja moved as a single entity to crush them once and for all. However, the entire force, except for one surviving Kiraja, fell into an ambush set by the Allied warriors. Most of the Allied fighters had remained behind to lure the Kiraja closer. Once the enemy was within striking distance, powerful explosives planted around the camp detonated, killing everyone present. The psychic aftershocks of this event reverberated across the entire planet. As the dust settled from their costly victory to the south, the other half of the Alliance army was besieging Kiranil. The sole survivor of the Kiraja was here, directing its defense and doing an admirable job of thwarting the unexpected yet underpowered attack on his homeland. Things looked bleak for the attackers until the telepathic cries of the dying Kiraja reached the central palace. The last Kiraja, driven mad by grief and mental trauma, ordered the gates to be opened immediately. Centuries of indoctrination compelled the inhabitants of Kiranil to obey. Consumed by a killing rage and empowered by the Vorlons, the Kiraja Empress charged against the Allied forces. History does not record the end of the last Kiraja, but the next dawn broke over the hills upon the ruins of Kiranil and the countless bodies of everyone who had been there the night before. Only those who had fled during the battle before the gates survived, most of them traumatized by the intense psychic energies of that epic conflict. As with the previous one, the Third Minbar War ended in silence. Once again, the Vorlons' designs had come to ruin, though their experiments survived in several generations of progeny. Knowing that they could recreate the Kiraja if necessary, they watched without interference as the Minbari brought themselves back from the brink of destruction. The shattered tribes of the Alliance returned to their devastated cities and began the long, arduous task of rebuilding what they once had. Everything seemed to return to normal, and the Vorlons resumed their secretive plans. However, appearances were deceiving. The Vorlons, accustomed to dealing with races only from an overhead perspective, overlooked the growing rage among the survivors of the Third Minbar War. While they rebuilt and the remaining Minbari of Kiranil found homes with outlying tribes and other settlements, a new mandate took hold among the allied tribes. The horrors of the Kiraja could never be allowed to occur again. With resolute determination, armies marched from the ravaged cities to seek out and eliminate the progeny of Kiranil's fallen warlords. Though the Vorlons moved to intervene, there were too many Minbari and too few of the powerful aliens. Unwilling to unleash their full powers against the Minbari for fear of worsening the situation through genocide, the Vorlons could save only a handful of the children of the Kiraja from the blades and guns of the outraged Minbari people. These few, the youngest children of the last generation, were set aside by the Vorlons and distributed to Minbari families across the planet. Telepathic alterations convinced the new parents of the children's legitimacy, allowing the Vorlons to preserve what they could of their vital experiment. A few older Kiraja who could hide or flee managed to survive the bloody purge, but most did not. These Kiraja were separated to make it more difficult for them to be found. Cursed with a visible sign of their parentage, a smaller-than-average skull crest, these heirs to the lost kingdom of Kiranil eventually found places to settle far away from the conflict. Most traveled south. Those who survived the journey were welcomed for their valuable gifts and used their powers to ensure such a reception. Not being the psychic titans their forefathers were, these descendants interbred with normal Minbari. In time, the existence of Kiranil and the Kiraja became a distant memory, later evolving into a legend through Vorlon intervention. The 5,000 years of isolation came to an end when the Vorlons, despairing of their repeated failures with the Minbari, sought to openly approach their wisest members once more to explain the truth as simply and entirely as possible. While specific details were likely omitted, the alien mentors took the elders of the Minbari into their confidence and offered them an open alliance, an exchange of technology for obedience. The time for subtlety had ended. If the experiment was to be saved, the Vorlons had to take a direct hand in its guidance.